Well, welcome back once again to the Claremont Review of Books Close Read podcast. We're so delighted to have you here with us discussing Volume 20, Issue Number 2 of the CRB. And we've had a few essays that we've selected to discuss in greater detail from this issue for these podcasts, and just really dig in a little bit more to some of the richest contributions that we had. This month, it's my delight to have with me here David P. Goldman, whom you may know from his variety of endeavors. He's an economist, a music critic, and perhaps most famously a columnist in the Asia Times under the pseudonym Spengler. But this time around, we're having him on the show to talk about this wonderful essay that he's written, the cover essay for this issue entitled The Chinese Challenge. And I think it's a testament to the prescience of this essay that David began writing it, I believe, before at least the world and we at CRB knew that coronavirus was going to be this vast fiasco across the world. And yet when coronavirus occurred, it fit perfectly into the assessment of China that David gives in this essay, which I'll just summarize briefly before we launch into chatting with him more a little bit. The main thrust of this essay, I think, is to sound a warning that anyone who has the idea that China is a kind of third world backwater that poses no threat to the United States on any economic or military level is really living in the past. David writes, "We aren't facing drunken, corrupt Soviet bureaucrats, but a Mandarin elite cherry-picked from the brightest university graduates of the world's largest country. America confronts something far more daunting than moth-eaten Marxism, a 5,000-year-old empire that is pragmatic, curious, adaptive, ruthless, and hungry. China's current regime is cruel, but no crueler than the Qin dynasty that buried 1 million conscript laborers in the Great Wall. China was, and remains, utterly ruthless." David, welcome to the show. It's really great to have you. Thanks for joining us.
It's an honor and privilege. Thanks for having me.
Well, this is a sobering essay, I think it's fair to say. It's become even more sobering in retrospect in light of the events that happened shortly before it was published. One of the themes that it brought to mind, as I read it over a few times, was this kind of old, almost like a saw from G. Michael Hopf, which is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. In ancient terms, we would have called this anacyclosis, the cycle of regimes. And I'm just thinking about the complacency of strong nations and the
Yes.
American complacency.
Here we call it shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations.
That's great. That's a new one on me. So is what you're describing in China here the kind of shock that a complacent nation needs, or does it spell doom for us? What's your prognosis here of America?
Well, I don't believe that doom is inevitable at all. I don't believe in predestination from a theological standpoint, and I don't believe in fate from a philosophical standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
I think our destiny is in our hands. But it's also the case that although we have faced challenges from formidable powers in the past, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, the difference with the challenge we face from China is simply how big it is. We always had an economy that was ultimately much bigger than those of our opponents. The German Tiger tanks might have been a lot better than Shermans, but we could set 6 or 10 Shermans against every Tiger.
Right.
In the case of the Russians, they had some very good military hardware. We, of course, leapfrogged them and crushed them in the 1980s with conventional superiority, particularly avionics. The difference is that China is 1.4 billion people, and thanks to our lack of foresight, our university system has trained up a world-class faculty for Chinese universities. It's always the human capital. It's always about the talent that you go to. And China's engineering schools make 10 of the top 50 on every global list you read. And that's because their professors were, until recently, doctoral candidates at University of Illinois or Texas A&M or Stanford.
Right.
So Chinese have come up the skill curve at an incredible rate, considering that in the 1960s and 70s, the Cultural Revolution burnt their university system to the ground. You have a generation in China which is capable, well trained, and has the sense that this is their historic moment after over a century where China went from being the world's top industrial power at the beginning of the 19th century to a miserably poor, chaotic, famine-prone, civil war-torn mess. They have the sense that we're coming back and the world can be our oyster. So the sense of ambition and drive that you get when you go to China is like opening your window on a cold and windy winter night. It's a blast of cold air.
Wow.
And it's impressive.
The digital element of this, which is also a theme in your essay, was one of the things that struck me most. You talk about Huawei and 5G and some of the ways in which China is at least aiming to outstrip us technologically and digitally. And you call Huawei an imperial company, which was one of the most sobering choices of words, just because it's not this sort of centralized agency so much as this tentacled beast that's kind of inserted itself imminently into the whole world. And that does strike me as quite a novel challenge. It especially strikes me as concerning, given what you say, that we've basically handed over a lot of our best knowledge and talent to China.
Indeed. China has learned to do one thing which they never did in their 5,000-year history, and that is to incorporate very large amounts of Western talent. Huawei has 200,000 employees. It's a big company. 50,000 of them are foreigners. The majority of them are engineers, mostly in Europe. Huawei bankrupted their European competition and hired their engineers and scientists. So when, for example, in England, the General Communications headquarters evaluated Huawei's technology from a security standpoint, the chief information officer of Her Majesty's government was talking to the former chief information officer for Her Majesty's government, who joined Huawei in 2011.
Wow.
Huawei has invested in every startup, every university, every lab in Britain that has anything to do with telecommunications. The British are very good at this. Remember, Marconi, which invented the radio, is a British company. But the Chinese managed to make their presence felt so strongly. They had such a big footprint in Britain that it's very difficult to get rid of them. And that's an important reason why the Boris Johnson government, which is friendly to the United States, Johnson's a friend of President Trump, refused American demands to keep Huawei out. They're so embedded. And that's true throughout the continent. That is a frightening thing. As you know, many people say the Chinese can't innovate. I think that's a huge exaggeration. The average Chinese engineer is less likely to want to innovate than the average American engineers, but there are plenty of Chinese who are good innovators. Even if that weren't the case, they can buy the innovation, they can hire the innovators, and they've been doing so. So their objective is an imperial objective to Sino-form the world, as it were, to export their model and onboard more and more Western and other Asian countries and become a snowball rolling downhill that gathers mass as it gains speed.
One of the governing metaphors in this essay, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I think in your forthcoming book too, is the Borg, right, from Star Trek. Next Generation.
You will be assimilated.
Yeah, right, exactly. And it's a telling metaphor because it's not the sort of American model of immigrant multiculturalism or what have you, but one of assimilation and homogeneity. That what China's really trying to do is basically turn us into them from the inside out. You seem to feel that they've been successful in that endeavor up to a point.
It's a very mixed picture. In 5G, they've been incredibly successful. There are very few countries in the world that have heeded America's urgent request not to do business with Huawei. Japan is one of them, but the Japanese will produce their own technology because they can and because they don't like the Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
Although, of course, when we shut down a lot of tech exports to Huawei, the Japanese stepped in and took that business away from us, and they're also supplying the Chinese. But for the most part, that's been extremely successful. When they've done more nuts and bolts on the ground kind of investments through their famous Belt and Road Initiative, this ultimately $2 trillion investment program in infrastructure, ports, railways, canals, and so forth, they've been far less effective. The Chinese have very poor experience dealing with countries outside themselves. They tend to be arrogant. They also tend to be corrupt and self-dealing. So I mentioned in my book a number of cases where they should have had a layup trade, for example, in Thailand, which is an American ally they'd love to absorb. But their handling of negotiations over a projected high-speed rail line from China to Thailand was so clumsy and so arrogant that it got pushed back years. So it is a mixed bag. The Chinese have racked up some major failures as well as some major successes. However, they're adaptive, they learn from their mistakes, and we can't count on them repeating the mistakes.
One question that occurs to me hearing you talk about that is, it's often pointed out to me when I express concerns about China, just what the terrible cost would be of extricating ourselves from some of these trade relationships. And I do wonder whether one of the ways that they've been successful is by creating a situation where people are, even if they're angry at China for coronavirus, even if they're protectionist on trade, they don't like the idea of a more expensive iPhone. And so, what's that?
This is a serious issue because to a great extent, this monster is of our own making.
Right.
After 2000, after the recession in 2000 and the tech bubble crash, the U.S. tech industry basically left the hardware business entirely. Cisco, for example, used to be the world's biggest producer of internet routers and high-end communications equipment. Basically, they don't produce software anymore, hardware anymore at all. They've all moved to software. And the tech industry model, which has been so successful in inflating stock prices, has been, we're going to let the Asians who get government subsidies to build chip fabrication plants and other capital-intensive installations do the dirty work for us. They'll do the manufacturing. We do the software. And the great thing about software is that the marginal cost of adding another customer is zero.
Sure.
If you're Facebook or Google or Microsoft or one of the great American software companies, and they are great companies, you have a printing press, you have a money machine, because your sales run far in advance of your incremental costs.
Right.
So only a few years ago, Neil Ferguson published a book entitled Chimerica about the symbiosis of China and America. Our imports from China alone, not counting the rest of Asia, are equal to a quarter of our manufacturing GDP. So if you say we dislike China so much, we're so disappointed or outraged by their behavior in the coronavirus situation that we wanted to couple instantly, we'd have to replace a quarter of manufacturing GDP, which is impossible, not only because of the capital costs, but because there really is a granularity of skills. The Chinese have trained large numbers of skilled people, engineers and skilled workers, who we simply haven't because they weren't needed here. That's a point made by Tim Cook, who a couple of years ago gave a speech in which he said he could not produce an iPhone in the United States, even if he wanted to. So my view is that we need to focus on priorities. It's all well and good to say, let's decouple from China and forget about them. Now, I was a decoupler when decoupling wasn't cool.
Sure.
I argued in an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal in 2016 that something like semiconductors, which go into nuclear submarines and rockets and fighter aircraft, should not be sourced from China. They should be produced in the United States under secure facilities. Why is Taiwan Semiconductor and why is Samsung? Why are they the two great semiconductor fabricators in the world because the government subsidize their plants, because they subsidize education for engineers. They have superb people. They're much better than anything we have in the United States. Now, to reproduce that kind of capacity in the United States would be difficult and expensive. We might be able to leapfrog it by introducing some better technologies at the frontier, but that's uncertain.
Right.
I think we need to do that kind of thing for national security reasons, apart from the economics.
Sure.
But the idea that we can instantly decouple from China, that the two largest economies in the world, which have been joined in the hip in a symbiosis largely brought about by our own tech industry,
right.
is a delusion. We need to focus our resources on things that will get us ahead of the Chinese in the future. You shoot at the rabbit, not where he is, but where he's running to.
Sure. Is there a moral dimension to this as well? It seems to me that we're willing to countenance practices in China that we've become unable to countenance in Western nations. So child labor or slave labor, what have you. And those practices seem to me to be part of the economic success. No, or is that an outdated view of how China works? Are we kind of exporting?
I don't believe that China is dependent on slave labor, particularly as it moves up the value added chain. But I do think that the Chinese regime does unspeakably cruel things frequently. For example, they had a problem with a restive minority of Turkic Muslims, the Uyghurs in their west in Xinjiang province.
Right.
So they put a couple of million of them through so-called re-education camps, which are basically concentration camps of brainwashing.
Right.
That's a level of cruelty which no Western country would countenance. Their treatment of political dissidents is abhorrent. Many things the Chinese do are, to me, as a Westerner, utterly repugnant. Though I would add that the Chinese regime has had a kind of governance which we find extremely cruel, and that's been true for a very long time.
Right.
There is a tendency, and it comes largely from Protestant missionaries, to believe that the Chinese people are wonderful and ready to embrace our way of life and our mode of thought if only we could get rid of these nasty communists at the top.
Right.
My view is that China is a much harder nut to crack. The Chinese society is organized very much like the mafia,
Wow.
where the Chinese detest their emperor. They never liked him. He's just the capo di tutti capi. He's there so that the other little capi will be more afraid of the emperor than they are of each other, and to keep the peace. Most Chinese I know will tell you we need an emperor, otherwise we'd kill each other. And in fact, when they didn't have an emperor, that's exactly what they did.
Right.
Periods of political chaos and warlordism, which had just horrendous human consequences.
Right.
So I think the only way to change China is to demonstrate that our way of doing things is so superior to theirs that they have to adapt themselves to us. And I would also like to encourage, and this is a bit against the fashion, I'd like to cherry pick the cleverest, most forward-thinking, independent-minded entrepreneurs and scientists from China and get them to the United States. Now, I recall a statement by one of Winston Churchill's military aides who said, "We won the war because our German scientists were better than their Germans."
Right.
And one way to keep the Chinese back is to deprive them of the services of some of their best people. A lot of them hate the regime. To be able to transform China, it's fine to say, look, they're a fact of life. They've been there for thousands of years. There's nothing we can do about it. That, in a certain sense, that's true in the short term. It's not, the Chinese are just not that into us.
Right.
They're radio-free China is not going to overthrow the regime anytime soon. A lot of people have illusions about this, but over time, I believe that demonstrating the superiority of the Western way of doing things will change China. The problem is that, to a great extent, we have abandoned the Western way of doing things, and we're doing things that don't reflect our best character. And that makes us that makes us the subject of ridicule
Right.
elsewhere.
Well, it certainly strikes me, the comparison with World War II strikes me as apt, if only that, Germany at the time was persecuting some of its best Germans, and therefore, it was in some sense easy to maybe sell them on the American way because it was so manifestly better than as it were getting killed in Germany. And I suppose that could be true in China too. I wonder what kind of superiority you were talking about demonstrating. Do you think that they're going to see how much more virtuous we are, or how much better we are economically? What are we attempting to demonstrate to them, and on what level are we attempting to win?
The West has always, well, at least since the 10th century, when the Chinese were inventing gunpowder and the compass and the Bessemer process during the Tang Dynasty, but at least for the last 1,000 years, the West has produced innovation after innovation, the scientific revolution, all the culture that the Chinese care about, while China was culturally stagnant.
Mm.
The Chinese do not play Chinese traditional music. They study Western classical music.
Sure.
At Chinese philosophy departments, they don't study Confucius. They study Kant or Bertrand Russell,
sure.
modern mathematical logic. The influence of Western culture is enormous, both in terms of the opportunity for the individual, the ability to realize that divine spark which seeks to express itself and create and grow. The West is vastly superior. It's very hard to put numbers on this, but I spent several years in Hong Kong as an investment banker, taking mainland firms public, dealing with a lot of Chinese, and I met any number of brilliant Chinese scientists and entrepreneurs who studied in the United States and would have loved to have stayed in the United States. They'd much rather raise their children in a country where the Communist Party doesn't encourage the kids to inform on them if they think something nasty about Xi Jinping.
Right.
I believe that the best and most forward-looking Chinese would enjoy living in the West more than they enjoy living in today's China. We have a very large number of Chinese Americans who are, of course, good American citizens. Obviously, we have a counterintelligence problem,
right?
Because the Chinese do spy on us assiduously.
Indeed,
they try to steal our secrets. They've done it. They've done a great deal of that, and they certainly use Chinese Americans to do that. But it's a matter of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It is a problem, but we don't want to deprive ourselves of the loyalty and enterprise of some of the world's hardest working and most intelligent people who could contribute to us, just as so many other waves of immigrants have contributed to us in the past. I'm very much a merit-based immigration guy. I think that we should get immigrants if they're going to add to the quality of life of people who are already here.
Yes, you alluded to the controversial nature of your view that we should basically cherry pick the best and brightest Chinese people and bring them over here. Is that the controversy? Is it that we sort of already feel as if they're establishing these Confucius institutes in our universities and keeping tabs on people and all this stuff?
No, absolutely. I mean, we have a problem. Confucius institutes are instruments of propaganda of the Chinese government.
Right.
Considering that Chinese government propaganda and public relations generally is probably the worst single thing that anyone ever came up with in world history. The Confucius Institutes, really don't worry me all that much, because the Chinese are so crude and obvious in their propaganda. It almost always backfires. But we do have a problem with espionage.
Right.
The tendency is to say, well, every Chinese here is suspect, and treat them like a suspect. And when you have counterintelligence services who operate that way, we end up alienating a lot of perfectly innocent and good American citizens who we needn't. That, as I said, that's a difficult, delicate task.
Sure.
But it's one which, if we are to succeed in this, we will need to manage.
Right.
The problem we've got, Spencer, is 5% of our kids in university take engineering as a major.
Mm-hmm.
That's all the Chinese PhDs who come here go back to China.
Right.
There aren't enough jobs for them because we don't have the undergraduates. 33% of Chinese college students major in engineering. Now, even if we said, let's have an Eisenhower-style National Defense Education Act, let's give scholarships to engineers and not to people who major in resentment studies,
right.
which I think would be a great thing. Even if we did that tomorrow, even if it were possible, our high schools are not producing enough qualified graduates. We have to go back to K through 12, and then we'd have the teachers' unions as an obstacle. Solving our manpower problem the way we did back in 1957 will take longer than it did then.
Right.
So in the meantime, we're short on skills. Companies, the tech industry demands more H-1 visas because without foreign students and foreign residents and temporary visas, they just don't have enough skilled people. If we really want to rebuild our industrial capacity, decouple from China, bring industries back on shore, we'll need a great deal more. Last I checked, we only graduated 30,000 mechanical engineers from American universities each year.
Right.
About less than half of what Germany does. China graduates 6 engineers for every one that we do.
Right.
So it will be extremely difficult for us to find the skills that we need to accomplish what I think we all want to do without immigrants. Now, you can get a lot from India. They make fabulous programmers.
Right.
But materials engineering, chemical engineering, and particularly electrical engineering are not an Indian forte. So I don't think we can accomplish this efficiently without recruiting some Chinese. That's simply a matter of the numbers, and I acknowledge the counterintelligence problem. It's simply a matter of how to manage it.
We are unfortunately reaching the point at which we're going to have to wrap up. I want to just ask you briefly, if you would, to comment on, in light of coronavirus, we're here under lockdown. We're doing this interview remotely, which we would be doing even if you weren't in New York. And I'm wondering whether you see this massive world event as in some sense hopeful for America's awareness of this issue, or whether you think that this is another nail in the coffin, or some mix of both.
Well, it certainly sharpens the situation. Defense Secretary Espers warned last week that China would attempt to exploit this crisis to entrench itself more deeply in 5G mobile broadband networks in the West. He's exactly right. The Chinese are telling the world, look at what we did. We suppressed this epidemic because we could track every prospective carrier down to the level of individuals and check everyone's location and correlate that with medical records with this vast data capability. And if only you buy our 5G systems, you too can join the Borg and be assimilated, and you'll be safe from epidemics. That is not a small selling point, because given that China's emphasis was to be tops in medical artificial intelligence from the beginning, that's one of their major ambitions. So it certainly gives China a strong selling point, but it also has shown the world how dangerous it is to rely on China, let alone to be dominated by China. So I hope it's a wake-up call to the United States, and I thank you so much for giving me this forum to tell people how urgent I think the situation is.
I'm only too glad to offer it, and I'll say just once more that this essay, which we began by discussing, is called The Chinese Challenge. It's the cover essay of the new Claremont Review of Books, which you can find at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, or indeed, if you are a subscriber, as you should be. If you're not, what's wrong with you? Then you will get the physical copy mailed to your home, or you may already have. David Goldman, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you, Spencer.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Claremont Review of Books podcast. I'm your host, Assistant Editor Spencer Clavin. The podcast is produced by Jake Gannon. The Claremont Review of Books is published by Ryan Williams and edited by Charles Kessler. For more great Claremont content, you can go to www.claremontreviewofbooks.com or www.americanmind.org. See you next time.